we see them pouring a lot of concrete. I made the first briefing board, and they labeled it Beersheba, possible nuclear installation under construction. And my boss took it to brief Eisenhower, and Eisenhower, after Lundahl briefed him, he just pushed it aside.
The reconnaissance photos surprise Brugioni. They show facilities similar to ones he's seen in aerial shots from France, where the US is also using spy planes.
All of a sudden, the reactor at Dimona, we renamed the place Dimona, it started taking on the same characteristics as the reactor at Mercoul. So I made a twofold briefing board. On one side, it opened up. On one side was French Mercoul photographs, and on this side was the Israelis. And proof without a doubt that the French had some connection with the Dimona installation. So Lundahl took it over to brief President Eisenhower, and President Eisenhower again pushed it aside.
The CIA wants to find out more, so it sends agents disguised as tourists to the Negev desert. This is some of the film taken by the CIA agents. For years, it remained undiscovered in a US archive. The agents wanted to find out what was being built with the huge amounts of concrete and who was sitting in the dozens of buses stopping in front of the facility each day. The American spies also report that the area around the facility is full of Mossad agents.
Well, the Israelis got really touchy. In fact, they roughed up one of our attachés when he tried to drive up to the area. And they were very sensitive, too. They were tailing our cars.
Film shot by the CIA agents shows that hundreds of French workers are employed at Dimona. They're housed in newly built settlements nearby. It's clear to the American spies that there's a secret Franco-Israeli nuclear weapons program. French President Guy Mollet and his defense minister Maurice Borges-Monory are pulling the strings.
Il s'est constitué petit à petit un petit club.
Gradually, they developed a secret circle, an exclusive club. Only those people, and not even members of the government, knew what was happening there. There were 20 or 30 members. Both countries were allied at the highest and most secret level. In other words, it was a kind of plot. And it's important to note that there was no official decision. We were supposedly a state of law, in which the parliament was theoretically very powerful. But parliament never approved these things.
Israel's negotiator, Shimon Peres, is even able to obtain a contract for their help in building the bomb. He collaborates with the club and stretches the limit of what's legal. He's determined to reach his goal.
Shimon Peres was able, in a way, to change the date or to write the date some hours or a day before, just to make it valid. To change the date or to write the date some hours or a day before, just to make it valid, even though the cabinet, the government that signed the contract already essentially lost power in a vote of no confidence. This just shows how much Shimon Peres was determined to get it, to bring it home, and virtually all the means were kosher just to get that, because the ultimately objective seems sacred in the eyes of Peres, in the eyes of Ben-Gurions, and in the eyes of those very few who were involved in that.
Israel has taken a huge step on its road to getting the bomb. The decisions in Israel and France are made outside of those countries' democratic institutions, although their effects are far-reaching for their citizens. Israel misleads the rest of the world about its true intentions.
The Israelis were denying that they had anything. Israel
has taken a huge step on its road to getting the bomb. The decisions in Israel and France are made outside of those countries' democratic institutions, although their effects are far-reaching for their citizens. Israel misleads the rest of the world about its true intentions.
The Israelis were denying that they had anything in this area. In fact, Shimon Peres said there was a textile mill under construction. It wasn't anything important.
But when Charles de Gaulle becomes president of France in 1958, the country's foreign policy changes drastically. The new leader wants the nuclear bomb for France, not Israel. It takes a while before de Gaulle can implement his new policies, however. And for a long time, he is unaware of what's going on behind the scenes.
General de Gaulle
was not immediately informed of the nuclear activities. It took 1.5 years until he'd been brought fully up to speed. Why wasn't he informed? Because the members of the club were in the political system, and they did all they could to reveal only a small part of what they knew.
Ben-Gurion remains undeterred, despite the new political line from Paris. The Israelis still lack launching systems for their nuclear weapons, especially missiles. They know they have to hurry before things change too much in France.
Then General de Gaulle decided to shut down the whole thing. But his orders were not carried out immediately on all levels. There were hurdles everywhere, because the club was strongly represented in the army and the administration, and was involved in politics. In other words, even General de Gaulle couldn't enforce his orders. The club's methods were shrewd. Every time a decision was made, the club counteracted it with all its might.
One example is the MD-620 missile. It was developed by the French defense contractor Dassault for Israel, even though officially there was no longer any cooperation. It later serves Israel as a launching system for nuclear weapons. But despite those supplies, Israel's relationship with France cools considerably. However, support soon comes from another source. Germany's Chancellor Konrad Adenauer is already supplying weapons to Israel. A document shows that he pledged 200 million marks to Israel annually for 10 years, starting in 1961. The negotiations were about what was referred to as a nuclear desalinization plant. No further details are known. The files about the secret cooperation remain classified to this day. Intelligence about the secret in the Negev desert is starting to leak out. That fuels speculation about Israel's possible nuclear weapons program. The political pressure is mounting. The focus of most attention is the nuclear reactor in Dimona, supposedly a textile mill. Can the Israelis produce weapons-grade plutonium there? In 1961, John F. Kennedy becomes President of the United States. Israel soon realizes there's resistance now from Washington too. Kennedy will try harder than any other US president to prevent Israel from getting the bomb.
At times it came also almost to confrontation. One time under President Kennedy when he pressed very hard for American bilateral access to Dimona in order to ensure that Israel would not be able to reach nuclear weapons capability in order to halt proliferation in the eyes of Kennedy in the Middle East. Ultimately, Israel prevailed in that kind of confrontation, but the confrontation was a tough one. The public knew very, very little about it.
Kennedy demands that Israel allow inspections in Dimona. He wants to make sure they're not working on nuclear weapons. He threatens to withdraw all US economic aid unless Jerusalem agrees. Israel relents. At least, it appears so.
À cause de la pression américaine, les Israéliens ont accepté une inspection de la commission.
put on enormous.
Américaine, les Israéliens ont accepté une inspection de la commission.
The Americans put on enormous pressure. So Israel agreed to an inspection of the reactor by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. Theoretically, it was a research reactor, and not a reactor that could produce plutonium. So over several months, the Israelis built a control center that had nothing to do with reality. Behind this control center sat engineers and scientists who had programmed everything in case the Americans wanted to inspect the controls. They had made sure the data shown corresponded to those of a civilian reactor.
In truth, Dimona serves only one purpose: its laboratory for plutonium and nuclear weapons. Publicly, the Israelis swear that it's a civilian project, but President Kennedy knows better.
And Kennedy very much wanted to see the non-proliferation treaty signed. So he put pretty brutal pressure on Ben-Gurion. And as part of that campaign, he also wanted to see the non-proliferation treaty signed. So he put pretty brutal pressure on Ben-Gurion. And as part of that campaign, he also, for the first time, agreed to provide Israel with weapons. Because Ben-Gurion told Kennedy, indirectly, of course, not face-to-face, look, if you want us to give up our nuclear program, we need other weapons to defend ourselves. So Kennedy agreed to provide Israel with Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. And what did Israel do with those missiles? Put them around the reactor in Dimona.
John F. Kennedy is assassinated in 1963. Under his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, America develops its friendship with Israel. From now on, the US will no longer look so closely at what's happening in Dimona. The Arab states, led by Nasser, as well as the Soviet Union, make more decisive calls for Israel to end its nuclear weapons program. They don't believe Israel's protestations.
In 1965, an Arab summit was held, and it was formally decided that the Arab world would not take this lying down, but would go to preventive war against Israel. An Arab summit was held, and it was formally decided that the Arab world would not take this lying down, but would go to preventive war against Israel.
The Soviets develop a secret plan. They want to provoke Israel into making an attack. And the Soviet Union guarantees the Arab states that if Israel detonates a nuclear bomb, Moscow will retaliate with a nuclear strike. But the Soviets don't know just how close Israel is to reaching its goals. A few days later, it completes its first nuclear bomb. The most important parts of the facility are hidden underground, 6 stories below the surface of the desert. Secret doors lead to Israel's nuclear weapons center. Here, nuclear warheads are made from plutonium. And here is where Mordechai Vanunu will later work. The 2 uppermost floors are purely for show. The Soviet Union believes it can stop Dimona without provoking a reaction from the United States.
As I mentioned, the situation in Vietnam was going against the American administration. They did not want another involvement. B, perhaps more importantly, if, as we found, one of the main Soviet aims was to stop the Israeli nuclear project before it could reach nuclear weapons, the Americans were not terribly happy about that project either. The situation in Vietnam was going against the American administration. They did not want another involvement.